On the morning of June 14, 1944, the small French coastal town of Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer lay shrouded in a thick morning fog that rolled in from the Atlantic. The cobblestone streets, still damp from overnight rain, reflected the pale grey light of dawn as fishing boats rocked gently in the harbour. In this town of approximately 1,300 souls, life had continued with a quiet resilience, despite 4 years of occupation by the German armed forces. The townspeople had learned to navigate the complex dance of survival, keeping their heads down while maintaining the small dignities that made existence bearable. Marguerite Beaumont had just turned 16 3 days earlier. Though there had been no celebration beyond a small cake, her mother had managed to bake with rationed flour and a single precious egg bartered from a neighbouring farm. She stood at the window of her family's modest home on Rue de la Liberté, watching the fog slowly lift to reveal the German communications post that had been established in the old town hall across the square. She had no way of knowing that within the next 12 hours, a decision she would make, one that seemed utterly insignificant at the moment, would set in motion a chain of events that would save every single person in her town from certain destruction. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What makes Marguerite's story so remarkable is not that she performed some grand act of heroism or possessed extraordinary courage beyond her years. Instead, her tale demonstrates how the smallest human choices, a moment of kindness, a brief hesitation, an instinctive act of compassion, can ripple outward in ways that alter the course of countless lives. This is the story of how one teenage girl's ordinary decision intersected with the machinery of conflict and produced an outcome that military strategists and historians would study for decades to come. To understand what happened in Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer that June day, we must first travel back several months to a converted farmhouse outside London, where Allied intelligence officers were planning operations that would support the liberation of France. Major William Crawford, a 42-year-old American intelligence analyst originally from Boston, Massachusetts, had spent the previous 18 months studying German defensive positions along the French Atlantic coast. His desk was perpetually buried under aerial reconnaissance photographs, intercepted communications, and detailed maps covered in annotations. Crawford had identified Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer as a critical node in the German coastal communication network. The town's position, situated on a rocky promontory overlooking a natural harbour, made it an ideal location for a relay station that connected German forces along a 200-kilometre stretch of coastline. According to Crawford's analysis, neutralizing this station would create a significant gap in German communications during the crucial days following the Allied landings that everyone knew were coming. The problem was the civilians. Crawford's reconnaissance photographs clearly showed that the German communications equipment had been installed in buildings scattered throughout the town centre, surrounded by homes, shops, and a small church that dated back to the 13th century. Any aerial operation against the military targets would inevitably result in civilian casualties, potentially the entire population of the town. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore, Crawford's superior officer, had reviewed the analysis during a meeting in late May. Whitmore was a pragmatic man of 53 who had served in the previous great conflict and understood the terrible arithmetic that commanders sometimes faced. He studied the photographs for a long moment before speaking. "This is precisely the kind of target we cannot afford to leave operational," Whitmore said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to authorize. "The communications disruption could save thousands of Allied lives during the landing operations. We have to consider the greater strategic picture." Crawford understood the logic. He had run the calculations himself. The potential Allied casualties that might result from intact German communications during the invasion far exceeded the population of Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer. From a purely numerical standpoint, the decision was clear. Yet Crawford found himself unable to simply accept it. "Sir," Crawford replied carefully, "what if we could find another way? What if we could neutralize the communications without destroying the town?" Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you proposing, Major?" "I'm not certain yet," Crawford admitted. but I would like permission to explore alternatives before we commit to a full aerial operation. Whitmore considered this for a moment before nodding slowly. You have 2 weeks, Major. After that, we proceed with conventional methods. There is too much at stake to delay indefinitely. Crawford threw himself into the problem with an intensity that surprised even himself. He studied the German communications equipment specifications, analyzed the power requirements, examined the terrain around the town, and consulted with technical specialists across multiple Allied commands. He was searching for a vulnerability, some way to disable the German operation without leveling the town around it. The answer, when it finally came, arrived from an unexpected source. A young British signals intelligence officer, named Lieutenant Sarah Pemberton, had been analyzing intercepted German communications from the Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer station. She noticed something unusual in the transmission patterns. "Major Crawford," Pemberton said, approaching his desk with a folder of transcripts, "I believe I have found something significant. The German station relies on a single primary power connection from a transformer station approximately 3 kilometers outside town. They have backup generators, but according to these intercepts, the generators are unreliable and require nearly 45 minutes to reach full operational capacity." Crawford leaned forward, his interest immediately piqued. "Are you suggesting that if we could disable the primary power supply at a critical moment, there would be a window of communications blackout?" "Precisely, sir, and the transformer station is isolated. No civilian structures nearby. A precision strike on that single target could achieve our objective without any risk to the town's population." The plan seemed almost too elegant. Crawford spent the next 3 days verifying every detail, examining aerial photographs of the transformer station, confirming the German backup generator specifications through additional intelligence sources, and developing a precise timeline. The operation would require exact coordination. The power had to be cut at a specific moment when the communications blackout would have maximum strategic impact. By the first week of June, Crawford's plan had been approved and scheduled for execution on June 14th. A small flight of Allied aircraft would target the transformer station at precisely 1400 hours, cutting power to the German communications post during a critical period of military activity. The town of Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer would be spared, but military plans, as every soldier knows, rarely survive contact with reality. And on the morning of June 14th, a series of events began unfolding that would threaten to unravel everything Crawford had worked to achieve. In Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer, Marguerite Beaumont's day began like any other. She helped her mother prepare breakfast, a thin porridge that was becoming increasingly difficult to make appetizing, and then set out on her usual errand to the town's small bakery to pick up the family's ration of bread. The fog had lifted by mid-morning, revealing a beautiful early summer day with clear blue skies and the kind of crisp ocean breeze that made the Atlantic coast so appealing in warmer months. The German soldiers who occupied the town had become a familiar presence over the years. Most were older men, members of garrison units assigned to rear area duties rather than frontline service. Marguerite had learned to navigate around them, acknowledging their presence with the minimum courtesy required, while maintaining the psychological distance that occupation demanded. There was one soldier, however, who had always seemed different from the others. His name was Private Wilhelm Hoffmann, a quiet young man of perhaps 20 years who had arrived in Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer 6 months earlier. Unlike many of his comrades, Hoffmann never strutted through the town with an air of conquest. Instead, he moved with a kind of apologetic awkwardness, as if perpetually embarrassed by his own presence. Marguerite had noticed Hoffmann several times at the bakery, where he would sometimes purchase bread with the careful counting of coins that suggested his military pay was meager. He always said please and thank you in heavily accented French, and once when an elderly woman had dropped her shopping basket, he had immediately knelt to help her gather her belongings, a small act that the other German soldiers had watched with evident disapproval. On this particular morning, Marguerite arrived at the bakery to find Hoffmann already there, engaged in what appeared to be a difficult conversation with Madame Girard, the baker's wife. The young German soldier was attempting to explain something, his French vocabulary clearly insufficient for the task. Marguerite hesitated at the doorway, her instinct telling her to wait until the soldier had left. Interaction with the occupation forces was always risky, and the fewer exchanges, the better. But something in Hoffmann's expression, a kind of desperate earnestness, made her pause. Madame Girard noticed her and called out, "Marguerite, perhaps you can help. This young man is trying to tell me something, but I cannot understand what he wants." Marguerite approached slowly, her heart beating faster than she would have liked. Up close, she could see that Hoffmann's face was pale and his hands were trembling slightly. He looked, she realized with surprise, genuinely frightened. Hoffmann turned to her, relief flooding his features when he recognized her from previous encounters. In broken French mixed with German words, he began speaking rapidly. Marguerite concentrated, trying to piece together his meaning from the fragments she could understand. "Danger," Hoffmann said urgently. "Today. Afternoon, you must tell everyone. Leave the town. Go to the countryside. Please." Marguerite felt a chill run through her, despite the warm morning sun streaming through the bakery windows. "Why should we leave?" she asked carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is happening this afternoon?" Hoffmann glanced around nervously, clearly aware that being seen having this conversation could have serious consequences for him. He lowered his voice even further. "I work in the communications post," he explained haltingly. "This morning, intercepted message, Allied aircraft coming, they will." He struggled for the word, making a gesture with his hands that unmistakably represented falling objects. "The town. They are coming for the town." Marguerite felt a wave of dread wash over her. She had heard stories of other French towns that had been targeted in aerial operations. The devastation, the casualties, the complete destruction. And now this young German soldier was telling her that Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer was next. "But why are you telling me this?" Marguerite asked, genuinely confused. "You are one of them. Why would you warn us?" Hoffmann was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "My mother's town," he said, "in Germany. Last year Allied aircraft came. She did not survive. My sister, my grandmother, all gone. I know what it is to lose everything." He met Marguerite's eyes directly. "I am a soldier because I had no choice. But I am not a monster. I cannot stand by and watch this happen to your town when I have the power to warn you." Marguerite stood frozen, her mind racing. Every instinct told her that this could be a trap, some elaborate scheme to identify resistance sympathizers or to test the loyalty of the local population. But looking into Hoffmann's eyes, she saw only sincerity and desperate hope that she would believe him. Madame Girard, who had been listening with growing alarm, spoke up. "Even if this is true, what can we do? We cannot simply evacuate the entire town on the word of a single German soldier. The authorities would never permit it." She was right, of course. The German command maintained strict control over civilian movement. Any attempt at a mass evacuation would be immediately noticed and stopped. And if the warning proved false or was discovered to have come from a German soldier, the consequences for everyone involved would be severe. This was the moment, the decision point that would later be analyzed and discussed in historical accounts for decades. Marguerite Beaumont, 16 years old, standing in a small French bakery, had to choose what to do with the information she had just received. Her first instinct was to run home immediately, to warn her family and help them flee to safety. But even as this thought formed, she realized its inadequacy. Her family alone surviving while her neighbors, her friends, the elderly couple who lived next door, the children who played in the square, all perished. That was not a victory she could live with. She needed time to think, time to develop a plan. But Hoffmann was already backing toward the door, clearly anxious to leave before his absence was noticed. "Wait," Marguerite said suddenly. "When exactly? When are the aircraft coming?" "The message said 1400 hours, Hoffmann replied. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you have perhaps 4 hours. And then he was gone, disappearing around the corner of the bakery, while Marguerite and Madame Girard stood in stunned silence. 4 hours. 4 hours to save 1,300 people without alerting the German authorities. It seemed impossible. And yet, as Marguerite walked slowly back toward her home, her mind began working on the problem with a clarity that surprised her. She could not organize a mass evacuation, but perhaps she did not need to. Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer, like many small French towns, had a tradition that dated back generations, the procession of Sainte Anne, a religious observance that took place every summer. The procession involved the entire town walking together from the church to a small chapel located approximately 2 kilometers outside the town center, where prayers were offered for the protection of fishermen and their families. The procession had not been held since the occupation began. German authorities had discouraged large gatherings, and the townspeople had been too demoralized to insist on maintaining traditions. But what if, Marguerite thought, what if the procession could be revived? What if everyone could be convinced to leave the town at the same time, under the cover of a religious observance that the Germans might tolerate? She needed help. She could not do this alone. Her first stop was Father Bernard, the elderly priest who had served Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer for nearly 40 years. Father Bernard was a cautious man, but he was also deeply devoted to his congregation. When Marguerite explained the situation, carefully omitting any mention of her German source, the priest's face grew pale. "If what you say is true," Father Bernard said slowly, "we have a moral obligation to act. But how can you be certain? How did you come by this information?" Marguerite hesitated. She knew that revealing Hoffmann's role could place the young soldier in extreme danger. But she also knew that Father Bernard would not act on unverified rumors. "There is a German soldier," she said finally, "a young man who works in the communications post. He intercepted a message this morning about an aerial operation. He warned me because he lost his own family in a similar attack. I believe him, Father. I believe he is telling the truth." Father Bernard was quiet for a long moment. "A German soldier who risks his own safety to warn us," he said thoughtfully. "Perhaps there is still some humanity left in this world after all." The priest agreed to help. Together they developed a plan to spread the word through the town's informal network of trusted families. The story would be that Father Bernard had decided to revive the procession of Sainte Anne as a special prayer for peace. The timing would be adjusted to begin at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, early enough to have everyone well outside the town center before 2 o'clock. For the next 3 hours, Marguerite moved through Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer with a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. She visited home after home, speaking to neighbors and friends, explaining that Father Bernard was organizing a special procession and that everyone should participate. She emphasized the importance of bringing children, of helping elderly neighbors who might have difficulty walking, of ensuring that no one was left behind. Not everyone was immediately receptive. Some questioned the timing, wondering why the procession needed to happen today of all days. Others worried about German reaction to such a large gathering. A few refused outright, unwilling to leave their homes and belongings unattended. For these holdouts, Marguerite found herself making increasingly creative arguments. She told one family that their presence was essential, because Father Bernard specifically wanted them to carry the traditional banner. She convinced another that the procession would pass by the farm where their daughter worked, giving them an opportunity to see her. For the most stubborn, she simply pleaded, putting all her conviction into the appeal. By 12:30 in the afternoon, the square in front of the church was filling with townspeople. Marguerite watched from across the street, counting heads, mentally checking off families she knew had been warned. The numbers were encouraging, but she could not be certain she had reached everyone. Father Bernard emerged from the church carrying a small wooden cross, and the crowd quieted respectfully. He spoke briefly about the importance of faith in difficult times, the power of community prayer, and the protection of Sainte Anne for fishermen and their families. Then, with a gesture that combined religious solemnity with unmistakable urgency, he began walking toward the edge of town. The procession moved slowly through the narrow streets, growing as it went. Marguerite positioned herself near the back, watching for stragglers and encouraging anyone who seemed hesitant. She saw Madame Girard from the bakery, supporting her elderly mother-in-law. She saw families with small children, young couples holding hands, fishermen who should have been preparing their boats. As they passed the German communications post, several soldiers emerged to watch the strange parade. One officer began walking toward Father Bernard, his expression suspicious. Marguerite felt her heart stop. "What is the meaning of this gathering?" the officer demanded. "Mass civilian movements require authorization." Father Bernard met the officer's gaze with calm dignity. "This is the procession of St. Anne, a religious tradition of this community for over 300 years. We walk to the chapel to pray for the souls of those lost at sea." I was not aware that prayer required German permission. The officer hesitated. Religious observances occupied a complicated space in occupation policy. Suppressing them risked unnecessary conflict with the local population, but allowing large gatherings created potential security concerns. After a moment of consideration, the officer stepped back. "Proceed," he said curtly, "but return before nightfall." The procession continued, moving past the last buildings of the town and onto the dirt road that led to the chapel. Marguerite glanced at her watch. It was 1:45. They would need to move faster. She worked her way forward through the crowd until she reached Father Bernard. "We need to hurry," she whispered. "There is not much time." The priest nodded and subtly increased his pace. The procession followed, snaking along the road through open farmland. The chapel was visible now, its small stone structure perched on a hillside overlooking the bay. At precisely 1:58, Marguerite heard the sound that had haunted her imagination for the past 4 hours, the distant drone of aircraft engines. She turned to look back towards Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer, her breath catching in her throat. The townspeople had stopped walking, turning as one to watch. From their position on the hillside, they had a clear view of the town below, its familiar rooftops and church steeple outlined against the blue waters of the harbour. And then, at exactly 2 o'clock, they saw the aircraft, 3 of them, flying low over the coastline, heading not for the town but for a point several kilometres to the east. Marguerite watched in confusion as the planes passed over the countryside, releasing their payload not on Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer, but on the isolated transformer station that powered the German communications equipment. The explosions were distant, muffled by distance, but clearly visible as plumes of smoke and debris rose into the afternoon sky. The transformer station, with its electrical equipment and fuel storage, burned with an intensity that sent black smoke spiraling upward. In the town below, the German communications post had gone dark. Officers rushed out of the building, shouting orders that no one could hear from the hillside. Within minutes, the characteristic sound of backup generators struggling to start echoed across the water. But the generators, as intelligence analysts had correctly predicted, failed to engage properly. The townspeople of Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer stood in stunned silence, watching the chaos unfold below them. They had been saved, though they did not yet fully understand how or why. It was only later that the complete picture emerged. Major William Crawford's carefully planned operation had succeeded exactly as designed. The transformer station had been eliminated, the German communications network had been disrupted, and the town had been spared. What Crawford could never have anticipated was that his operation would intersect with Marguerite's evacuation in a way that revealed the truth about what had actually been planned. The intercepted message that Wilhelm Hoffmann had seen that morning was not an order for an aerial attack on Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer itself. It was a German intelligence assessment warning that Allied aircraft might target the nearby transformer station, and predicting incorrectly that the Allies would also strike the town to ensure complete neutralization of the communications capability. German intelligence had assumed, based on their own military doctrine, that the Allies would not distinguish between military and civilian targets. They expected the comprehensive destruction of both the power source and the communications post itself. The idea that the Allies would develop a precision plan specifically designed to spare the civilian population had not occurred to them. Hoffmann, reading the intercepted assessment, had understood only that Allied aircraft were coming and that the town was in danger. His warning to Marguerite had been based on this incomplete understanding, and yet, in a profound irony, his warning had been unnecessary for the town's survival, but essential for revealing the true nature of Allied planning. In the days that followed, the full scope of what had happened became clear to the townspeople. They learned about Crawford's plan, about the months of careful analysis that had gone into finding a way to achieve military objectives without civilian casualties. They learned that they had never actually been in danger from the Allied operation. But they also learned something equally important, that a young German soldier had believed they were in danger and had risked everything to warn them. Hoffman's actions, based on incomplete information, had demonstrated a moral courage that transcended the boundaries of the conflict. For Marguerite, the aftermath brought a complex mixture of emotions. She had organized an evacuation based on a threat that, as it turned out, did not exist in the form she had believed. Some might have seen this as an embarrassing overreaction, but the more she thought about it, the more she understood the deeper significance of what had occurred. She had been presented with a choice: to act on incomplete information in defense of her community, or to remain passive and hope for the best. She had chosen action, and while the specific threat she had prepared for did not materialize, her decision had revealed something profound about human nature and the possibility of compassion even in the darkest circumstances. Wilhelm Hoffmann's fate remained a mystery for many years. He disappeared from Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer shortly after the events of June 14th, presumably transferred to another posting. The townspeople who knew of his warning kept his secret, understanding that revelation could have meant severe punishment for the young soldier. It was not until 1947, 2 years after the conflict's end, that Marguerite learned what had become of him. A letter arrived at her family's home, postmarked from a small town in Bavaria. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the signature at the bottom made her gasp. Hoffmann had survived. He had been transferred to the Eastern Front shortly after the Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer incident, had been captured, and had spent nearly 2 years in a prisoner camp. After his release, he had returned to Germany to find that his hometown, the same town where his mother, sister, and grandmother had perished, was now part of the American occupation zone. "I have thought about you and your town every day since that morning in the bakery," Hoffmann wrote. "I have wondered whether my warning helped, whether the people survived, whether my actions made any difference at all. For a long time I believed I would never know. But recently I met another former soldier who had served in Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer, and he told me the story of the procession of Sainte Anne, how the entire town walked to the chapel on the afternoon of June 14th, 1944, and how everyone survived. He told me that the procession was organized by a young French girl named Marguerite. I knew then that my warning had reached you, and that you had found a way to act on it. I am writing to thank you, not for saving your town, because I now understand that the Allied operation was never going to harm the civilians anyway, but for believing me, for trusting that a soldier wearing the uniform of your enemy could still be capable of human compassion. In a world that taught us to see each other as enemies, you saw me as a person. That small act of faith has given me hope that humanity can survive even the worst of what we do to each other." Marguerite kept that letter for the rest of her life. She would show it to her children and grandchildren, using it to illustrate a lesson that she believed was more important than any military history or strategic analysis. The events of June 14th, 1944, she would explain, were not really about aircraft or communications posts or military operations. They were about the choices we make when we encounter each other as human beings. Wilhelm Hoffmann chose to see me and my neighbors as people worth saving, even though we were supposed to be his enemies. I chose to believe him, even though I had every reason to be suspicious. Major Crawford chose to spend months finding a way to achieve his military objective without harming civilians, even though easier options were available. None of these choices changed the outcome of the larger conflict. The forces of history are too vast to be altered by individual decisions, but they changed us, the people who made them and the people who witnessed them. They proved that even in the midst of humanity's worst moments, the capacity for compassion and courage remains. Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer still stands today, its medieval church and narrow streets preserved much as they were in 1944. A small plaque near the town hall commemorates the events of that June day, though the full story is known only to those who seek it out. Every year on June 14th, the townspeople still walk the procession of St. Anne to the chapel on the hillside. It is no longer an evacuation disguised as a religious observance. It is a genuine act of remembrance, a way of honoring the choices that were made on that day so many decades ago. And every year, as the procession passes the spot where the German communications post once stood, the oldest residents pause for a moment of silence. They are remembering not just the events they survived, but the people who made their survival possible. An American intelligence officer who refused to accept civilian casualties as inevitable, a German soldier who chose human compassion over military loyalty, and a 16-year-old girl who trusted her instincts and organized her community to act on incomplete information. The story of Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer is not a tale of military victory or strategic genius. It is something more important, a reminder that history is made not just by armies and governments, but by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and choosing in small but significant ways to affirm the value of human life. Marguerite Beaumont lived to be 93 years old, passing away peacefully in 2021. She spent her final years in the same house on Rue de la Liberté, where she had stood at the window on that foggy morning in 1944, watching the German communications post and having no idea that her life was about to change forever. In interviews conducted by historians in her later years, she was always careful to emphasize that she did not consider herself a hero. "I was a 16-year-old girl who made a decision based on what seemed right at the time," she would say. The decision turned out to be unnecessary in the narrow sense. The town was never actually going to be attacked. But I believe it was still the right decision, because it revealed something true about who we can be when we choose to trust each other. Her story has been studied in military academies as an example of the unpredictable human elements that can influence even the most carefully planned operations. It has been analyzed by psychologists interested in decision-making under uncertainty. It has been cited by philosophers discussing the ethics of action based on incomplete information. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from an unexpected source. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the conflict's end, a delegation from Germany visited Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer. Among them was an elderly man in his 70s, walking with a cane but still possessing the quiet dignity that Marguerite had noticed so many years before in a young soldier at the bakery. Wilhelm Hoffmann had come to see the town he had helped save, or rather, the town he had believed he was helping save, before he understood the full complexity of what had actually occurred. He and Marguerite, now in her late 60s, stood together on the hillside overlooking the harbor, looking down at the rooftops that had seemed so vulnerable on that distant June afternoon. "I have spent 50 years wondering whether I did the right thing," Hoffmann said quietly. "I disobeyed orders. I revealed military intelligence to civilians. I could have faced severe consequences if I had been discovered. And in the end, my warning was based on a misunderstanding. The town was never going to be attacked anyway." Marguerite took his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable 50 years earlier when they stood on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. "You did the right thing," she said firmly, "not because of what happened or did not happen to the town, but because of what you chose to be in that moment. You chose to be someone who could not stand by while innocent people faced what you believed was certain destruction. That choice defined you. It defines all of us, every day, in the small decisions we make about how to treat each other." The two of them stood in silence for a long moment, watching the sun set over the Atlantic. Below them, the town of Saint-Nazaire-sur-Mer was preparing for evening, lights coming on in windows, the smell of dinner being prepared, the sounds of children playing in the square. It was a scene of ordinary life, unremarkable in its peaceful domesticity. But for Marguerite and Wilhelm, it represented something extraordinary, the persistence of human community through the worst that history could throw at it, the survival of compassion and connection in a world that had tried its best to destroy both. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.